I am Leah, 34 years old, the middle daughter in an American family of 3 siblings. I have been used to feeling looked down on ever since I was young. At home, my older brother, Christopher, now 41, was always the pride of my parents. He followed the exact path they wanted. Graduated from Yale, then became a senior vice president at a well-known financial corporation in New York. His luxury condo in Manhattan and expensive vacations at Martha's Vineyard were constant talking points for my parents. Every time the family gathered, just mentioning his job or a few names from Wall Street was enough to make them beam with pride, as if the family's honor rested entirely on his shoulders. My younger sister, Natalie, now 30, chose a different road but just as quickly became the golden child in their eyes. She married Daniel, the only son of a family that owned a regional chain of banks. Natalie's lavish wedding even landed on the cover of a local bridal magazine, and since then her life has been filled with charity galas, golf clubs, and photo shoots in designer gowns. My parents often told their friends that Natalie had married smart, that she embodied every parent's dream, rich and socially admired. And then there was me, Leah, the middle child who never fit into the mold they built. Christopher was composed and strategic. Natalie was charming and knew how to impress. I was different. I always asked questions, always wanted to explore on my own, and never cared for the rules. That difference made me the black sheep of the family, the one who always came out poorly in comparisons. Even back in high school, the gap was obvious. Christopher was student body president, Natalie became homecoming queen, while I spent most of my time in the computer lab, tinkering with code and selling simple websites to local bookstores or corner shops in town. For me, it was joy, a spark of a bigger dream. But in my parents' eyes, it was just child's play, a hobby with no future. I still remember that night at 19 when I announced I wouldn't go to college like they expected. Instead, I would chase my own startup path. Dinner turned so silent I could hear the clinking of forks against plates. My father, David, finally said heavily, "You will regret this for the rest of your life." He wouldn't even look at me, his eyes fixed on the table. My mother sighed, while Christopher spoke in a pitying tone that I should be more realistic, instead of chasing foolish dreams. Natalie just smirked as if I were performing some bad joke. That night I sat alone in my room, tears falling on the handwritten business plans. But the pain quickly hardened into determination. I knew if I stayed, I would forever be forced into the mold they made for me. I needed to write my own story. So I left my hometown in Wisconsin with only $300 in my wallet and a burning ambition. I boarded a long-distance bus to Chicago, filled with fear yet brimming with hope. The years that followed were a journey Christopher and Natalie could never have imagined. They thought I had failed, living in some cramped apartment, scraping by with odd jobs. They repeated that assumption in family calls. Christopher once asked in his fake concern voice, "Do you have enough to cover rent?" Natalie handed me her old dresses from last year, saying, "You'll need these for job interviews." I only smiled, thanked them, and never corrected their version of my life. In my family's eyes, I remained the poor one, the daughter left behind on the track they believed was the only race worth running. My memory of the morning I left Cedarfield, that small town in Wisconsin, is still vivid in my mind. I was 24, clutching an old leather wallet with only $200 left and a bus ticket to Chicago. The sky was gray, the late October wind biting cold. My father, David, didn't bother to see me off, leaving only the harsh judgment from the night before, "You'll come back a failure." My mother stood on the porch, her eyes brimming with tears but saying nothing. That silence cut deeper than any criticism. Christopher already had his first job in New York and didn't even call. Natalie was busy preparing to get engaged to Daniel and couldn't care less where I was going. I remember sitting in the last row of the bus, a swirl of fear and excitement in my chest. I had no detailed plan, only the burning drive to prove my path wasn't a joke. Chicago rose before me like a massive maze, skyscrapers stacked one after another, crowds flowing endlessly. I rented a cramped room in an old housing complex on the west side, where winter winds slipped through every crack in the walls. In those first months, I did whatever I could to survive. Waiting tables at a cafe, packing boxes in a warehouse, even serving drinks at a noisy bar. Each night I came home, opened my beat-up laptop and coded late into the night, building demo websites for small shops in the neighborhood. There were times I thought I wouldn't make it. After 3 months, my savings barely covered rent and canned noodles. I took on a project for an electronics store, working 48 hours straight without sleep just to deliver on time. When they paid me $300, I held that check tight as tears streamed down my face. It wasn't about the money, it was proof I could survive on my own idea. My family still assumed I was barely scraping by. In one call, Christopher asked in his half-mocking tone, "You're still stuck in that dump, aren't you? Need me to send you some money?" I answered simply, "I can manage." Natalie sent me a worn-out business dress from last season with a note, "You'll need this for a real job interview." I laughed bitterly at the gift. In their eyes, I was still the stubborn girl destined to collapse sooner or later. But reality was different. I started getting more website contracts, then expanded into data security. Back then, small e-commerce businesses had no reliable protection, and I dove straight into that gap. Some months I barely slept, sitting in the dark room surrounded by sticky notes on the wall, juggling projects while teaching myself cybersecurity. I nearly went bankrupt twice. Once when a big client canceled, another when hackers wiped my test data. Those nights, I curled up on the floor, listening to the wind howl through the window, wondering if my father was waiting for the day I'd call and beg for help. But I didn't. Instead, I rebuilt everything from scratch. 3 years later, at 27, I had a small team of 4 working out of a rented basement. We ate cold pizza, drank cheap coffee, and cheered loudly the night our first security system finally worked. That was the first time I felt I was truly on the right path. In the rare calls with my family, they still believed I was doing odd jobs. My mother asked, "Do you have enough to eat? Should I send you some canned goods?" I swallowed hard, then smiled. "I'm fine, Mom." They had no idea that at that very moment I had just signed a licensing deal with a large retail chain. That deal changed everything for my young company. Revenue climbed, and we moved from the dark basement to a bright office near downtown. I hired more staff, including Marissa, who later became my most trusted right hand. Even then, I kept my success quiet. I chose to live simply, driving an old car I bought off Craigslist and renting a modest apartment. I didn't want anyone, especially my family, to know how far I had come. Maybe part of me wanted to let their condescending looks pile up, just so one day I could flip the script myself. The years passed and my company grew stronger. I learned to negotiate, to endure failure, and to stand up again after brutal setbacks. By the time I turned 32, I was no longer the girl who left Cedarfield with $200. But in my family's eyes, I was still just poor Leah, the one always in need of their so-called kindness. And I let them believe it. In the early years of building my business, I stood on the edge of collapse more than once. There were times when my bank account held only a few $100s, and the tiny basement office had its power shut off because I couldn't pay on time. Still, my small team and I kept pushing forward, testing and retesting data security solutions for small and mid-sized businesses. Day blurred into night as we strained our eyes over lines of code and endless design drafts, while friends my age enjoyed steady office jobs with predictable paychecks. The real breakthrough came when an online retail company, fresh off a major data breach, reached out to me. I introduced a prototype of a new technology, a multi-layered encryption system powered by artificial intelligence. It worked beyond expectations, sealing every gap hackers had exploited. Word spread fast. What began as a small team suddenly became a company flooded with partnership requests. I named it Sentinel Shield. 2 years later, we had a spacious office in downtown Chicago. I still lived modestly, driving a 10-year-old sedan and renting a normal apartment. But inside that office, a team was working day and night on technology that industry experts were starting to respect. By then I was 31, and for the first time, I dared to believe my dream was taking shape. That success deepened when I filed a patent for our proprietary security algorithm. It was the key that set Sentinel Shield apart. Soon, major corporations began to notice. I still remember the tense meeting with a venture capital firm in New York. They sat across from me, eyes skeptical, seeing only a young woman without an Ivy League degree, claiming she could change global security standards. I spoke calmly, without a trace of fear. And when my demo system blocked 3 simulated attacks in under 60 seconds, the entire room went silent. In that moment, I knew my position had shifted. Months later, a successful funding round pushed our valuation past $50 million. Then a leading tech giant from California made an offer. The number they placed on the table left me speechless for a few minutes. $52 million in cash, plus the right to retain equity and continue leading product development. I signed the deal on a summer afternoon, sunlight streaming through the glass windows, my chest swelling with emotions, relief, pride, and a sharp sense of conflict. I became a millionaire at 33. But the first thing I did wasn't buying a luxury car or a mansion. I pulled out a large sum to start a charitable foundation, building schools in underprivileged areas. I invested in medical cybersecurity research, helping small hospitals defend against cyber attacks. Money became a tool to fulfill the vow I had made at 24, to create real value, not just to prove myself. Yet to my family I was still Leah the failure. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, I sat quietly as Christopher bragged about multi-million-dollar deals on Wall Street or Natalie boasted about vacations at beachfront villas. They never truly asked what I did, and if they did, it was just for form's sake. I chose silence. Something inside me wanted to keep that secret until the moment I decided to reveal it. Once at our mother's birthday dinner, Christopher leaned in, half joking, half serious. "Leah, if you need help paying your rent, just say so. I don't want you to feel embarrassed." I gripped my glass tightly, forcing a smile. "Thanks, but I'm fine." Fine. That word became the curtain hiding everything. They had no idea I had just signed a contract with a billion-dollar corporation. No idea my bank account could buy an entire stretch of land on the outskirts of Chicago. I stayed quiet, swallowing back every word I longed to say. I often asked myself why I chose silence. Maybe because the wounds from the past had never truly healed. In my parents' and siblings' eyes, I was still the girl who dropped out of college to chase a startup fantasy. And I let them go on believing it. In Chicago, I lived in a spacious apartment overlooking a park, fully furnished with every comfort. But every time I returned to Cedarfield, I carried a faded canvas bag, wore an old sweater, and slipped on scuffed shoes. They were so used to seeing me look plain, and I had no intention of changing that image. Partly because I felt comfortable, partly because I wanted them to cling to their illusions, so that when the truth finally surfaced, it would shake them to their core. One Thanksgiving, I drove home in a 10-year-old sedan, a car I had kept just for these visits. Christopher saw me step out from behind the wheel and immediately sneered with half pity, half scorn. "Leah, that car's about to fall apart. You're not planning on getting something better?" I smiled and answered simply, "It still runs fine and I don't need more." That plain reply made him laugh, as if it confirmed every opinion they already held about me. Natalie gave me an old designer scarf, saying, "This will make you look more presentable for job interviews." I folded it neatly, thanked her, and said only, "Thanks." Those kinds of gifts kept coming. Outdated business suits, gift cards to discount clothing stores. I never refused because each time it only highlighted the gulf between what they thought of me and the reality I lived. While they believed I was barely scraping by, I actually held shares in a tech company worth tens of millions of dollars. At family dinners, I often sat quietly, listening to Christopher go on about the financial markets or Natalie gush about her vacations in the Florida Keys. They spoke to each other, laughed together, and occasionally turned to me with token questions. "Leah, how's work going these days?" I nodded, giving the same short reply, "Fine." Just one word, enough for them to move on without caring. That "fine" became my armor, hiding the truth that every month I funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into education projects, that I owned a penthouse where the elevator opened directly onto the top floor. Sometimes I felt cruel letting my parents believe I was struggling. My mother once called, her voice worried. "Do you have enough to eat? Should I send you some dried goods?" I sat in my large kitchen, shelves stocked with fine wines and a refrigerator full to bursting, and gently answered, "I can manage, Mom." My father rarely called, but whenever we met, he slipped in words like blades. "Leah, don't you think it's time to get a real job?" I never argued, just smiled it off. I knew debate would change nothing. They had written a script for me and I let them keep performing it. But the longer I kept the secret, the heavier it grew. At my company, I was the CEO making million-dollar decisions with a staff ready to work overnight at my call. Back home, I was the pitted daughter, assumed to be counting pennies. That stark contrast choked me more than once, made me want to blurt out the truth. Yet I always swallowed it back. One Christmas dinner, Christopher boasted about the new condo he had bought in Manhattan for $7 million, then ended with, "Leah, if you need, I can loan you some money to get yourself a decent place." The whole table chuckled lightly as if it were a generous joke. I laughed too, but inside a storm surged. I wasn't angry that they underestimated me. I was angry that they had never once tried to see me as I really was. I lifted my head, met Christopher's gaze, and almost told him that my own apartment overlooked a vast city park and was worth many times what he was bragging about. But instead I raised my glass and replied softly, "I'll remember your offer." One February morning I got a call from Christopher. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of the arrogance he normally carried. "Leah, Mom just fell in the kitchen and broke her hip. And Dad's memory loss is progressing faster than expected. We need to sit down and talk about long-term care. I want you back in Cedarfield this weekend for a family meeting." I froze for a few seconds, heart pounding. In the past 10 years I had never been called back as an equal. But his next words snapped me back to reality. "Just contribute whatever you can. Natalie and I will handle most of it. You only need to put in a small symbolic amount." I could still hear the pity in his tone. Even when it came to our parents, he assumed I wasn't capable. I quietly replied, "All right, I'll be there this weekend." Hanging up, I stood by the window of my apartment in Chicago. Outside, snow blanketed the park, but inside me a storm was rising. I had been preparing for this return for years. But should I reveal everything? Or let them go on believing Leah was still struggling? 3 days later, I boarded a bus back to Cedarfield. I made sure to carry my faded canvas bag, wear my old sweater and scuffed shoes. Every detail was calculated to reinforce the image of poor Leah. I wanted to hear their true thoughts before the truth came crashing down. When I stepped into the white 2-story house of my childhood, Christopher was at the door. He wore a gray cashmere sweater and crisp khakis, looking more like he was headed to a presentation than greeting his sister. He glanced at me from head to toe, lips pressed tight, then said, "You're late. Bus must have taken a while, huh?" I smirked, saying nothing. He picked up my canvas bag with 2 fingers as if afraid to dirty himself and continued, "Mom's resting in the living room, Dad's dozing in his chair. Go on in." Inside, Mom's face lit up when she saw me, though she was still weak. Dad looked thinner, his hair completely white, his eyes distant. I took his hand softly. "I'm home, Dad." He looked at me a moment, then smiled gently. "Leah, my girl." His trembling voice made my chest tighten. Despite the bitterness of the past, I had never stopped loving them. But love had always been tangled with sorrow at the favoritism they showed my siblings. That afternoon, Natalie arrived with her husband Daniel. Natalie was wrapped in an expensive knit dress with a designer scarf, Daniel carrying bags of gourmet groceries. She rushed to hug Mom, then launched into stories of their Florida vacation as if at a tea party. Seeing me, she smiled. "Leah, I'm glad you made it. We need to have a serious talk." Dinner had been catered from an upscale restaurant in town. Red wine, roast chicken, and salads filled the table. I helped Mom into her chair while Natalie patted my shoulder, saying with faux warmth, "You're thoughtful, Leah. Even if you can't contribute much money, at least you can help take care of Mom day to day." Heat rose in my chest, but I smiled. I wanted them to speak freely. Christopher sat at the head of the table, while Natalie and Daniel whispered about vacations and new property deals. I quietly served salad to Mom and listened as they flaunted their successes like sugar-coated knives. Christopher began proudly. "Last week I was invited to a conference in Boston. They're considering me for the executive board. If it works out, next year I'll be moving into the top floor office." He paused, glancing at me to highlight the contrast. "Leah, maybe I'll show you around. A real professional environment might inspire you." I just nodded, hiding a small smile. Natalie chimed in sweetly but with clear intent to show off. "Oh, Daniel just invested in a resort in Colorado. Last week we flew out on our private jet to see the land. It was unbelievable. When it opens, Leah, you'll have to come. We'll let you enjoy it for free." Laughter rippled around the table. I took a sip of water, staying silent. To them, my silence was weakness. To me, it was a shield. When dessert came, Natalie pulled out a small, glittery gift box and set it before me. "Leah, just a little gift for you. Something to encourage you." Inside was a gift card for a budget clothing chain. The amount printed clearly, $75. Natalie smiled, hand on my shoulder like she was bestowing charity. "I think you could use a few new outfits, something fitting for job interviews. And You should try to look a little more polished. I heard Christopher chuckle under his breath. He added casually, dripping with mockery, "Yeah, Leah, sometimes just dressing differently makes people think you're doing better." I looked at the gift card, then up at them, replying lightly, "Thanks. I'll make use of it." No one knew I was thinking of million-dollar contracts locked away in my Chicago office. No one knew that the so-called big gift wasn't even equal to the interest I earned in a single hour. Dad sat silently in his armchair, eyes weary, detached from their comparisons. Mom forced a faint smile despite her pain, but I caught a shadow of sadness in her eyes as Natalie handed me the gift. Deep down, perhaps she knew I didn't deserve this treatment. Yet she said nothing. Daniel added blandly, "Leah, if you want, Natalie can connect you to some side jobs. The pay's not high, but at least it's steady. Better than living unstable forever, right?" I swallowed back everything and smiled. "I'll think about it." The dinner dragged on with Christopher's boasts and Natalie's lavish stories. As they spoke of Italy getaways and rare wines Daniel had just won at auction, I nodded politely, asking only short questions. In their eyes, my quiet was incompetence. But in my mind, one thought was crystal clear. It was time. Before leaving the table, Natalie patted my shoulder again. "Leah, I really hope someday you'll settle down. Life isn't just about dreaming, you know." I met her gaze, still smiling softly. "You're right. Someday." After dinner, Christopher opened a thick file in his laptop, projecting slides. He spoke in his familiar professional tone. "Here are the best medical care options for mom and dad. Average cost is around $8,000 a month. Natalie and I discussed splitting it. I'll cover 45%, Natalie and Daniel 40%. He stopped, staring at me with condescension. "That leaves 15%, about $1,200 a month. Can you handle that? If not, no big deal. Just contribute a token amount and we'll cover the rest." Natalie added sweetly but sharp, "Don't worry, Leah. We don't expect much from you. Just enough to show you care." I stared at my glass, gripping it tightly. In their eyes, I was forever the outsider, asked only for a token gesture. No one had ever asked what I was truly capable of. I set down the glass, calmly pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Marissa, confirm." Her cheerful voice came through. "Everything's ready. 5 minutes." I smiled, slipping my phone away. Christopher frowned. "Leah, we're in the middle of something serious. Can you take your personal calls later?" I answered evenly, "Go on. The family's in for a surprise." Within minutes, the low roar of an engine grew louder. The windows rattled. Natalie frowned toward the window. "What's that sound?" Christopher waved dismissively. "Probably farm equipment. Let's get back to Leah's situation." But then the pounding blades of a helicopter shook the house. Floodlights lit the lawn as a sleek black helicopter descended. Everyone jumped up. Mom trembled, Dad's eyes widened. Natalie clutched Daniel's arm, voice trembling. "Oh my God, a helicopter?" I rose slowly and walked to the door. Christopher's voice cracked. "Leah, what is this?" I turned to face them. "You say I can't even afford a car." "That's true. I don't have one. Because I travel differently." I opened the door, the rotor wash whipping my hair. The uniformed pilot stepped down and bowed. "Your flight is ready, ma'am." The room fell into stunned silence. Mom sank into her chair, clutching her chest. Dad stared at me, lips trembling but speechless. Christopher gripped the chair rail, pale. Natalie stood frozen, wide-eyed. I stepped to the table, pulled out a neatly bound file from my jacket and placed it before them. My voice was steady. "This is the Everhart Foundation, which I founded. We purchased a top-tier senior care center with special programs for Alzheimer's and post-surgery recovery." I looked each of them in the eye. "Mom and Dad will have the best care, fully covered for the rest of their lives. I don't need to contribute $500 or $600 like you planned. I've already taken care of everything." Christopher let out a shaky laugh. "Leah, what are you saying? Charity fund? You think this trick convinces anyone?" At that moment, Marissa, my assistant, stepped inside from the lawn, holding a thick stack of documents and certifications from the Department of Health. She set them in front of Christopher, her voice firm. "All the legal paperwork and financial records of the foundation. You can verify any time." Christopher's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. his expression shifting with each one. Natalie sank into her chair, speechless. I continued, voice harder now. For years, you've treated me like a burden, someone surviving off scraps. But today the truth is right here. I don't need pity. I am the one who created the solution for this family. Silence swallowed the room, broken only by the steady whir of the helicopter outside. I looked at Mom and saw her eyes brimming. Dad nodded faintly as if in recognition. I turned to the door, then back once more. If you want, you can come with me right now. The helicopter will take us to the center. You can see for yourselves where Mom and Dad will be cared for, without dependence, without calculations. The room was steeped in silence as I stepped toward the door. No one moved, no one spoke. They were still drowning in the shock. I smiled faintly and walked toward the helicopter. But before I could climb aboard, Mom's trembling voice called out, "Lee, don't go. I need to talk to you." I turned back. The whole family was still frozen around the table. Christopher clutched my folder tightly, his eyes caught between awe and bitterness. Natalie hadn't recovered, her hands shaking as she gripped her scarf. Dad looked at me with a strange mix of pride and regret. I slowly sat down again. Christopher spoke first, his tone stripped of superiority. "Lee, why did you hide this from us? You let us believe you were poor all these years." I answered simply, "Because the truth never mattered to you. You were too used to seeing me as a failure." Natalie let out a short, bitter laugh. She placed her hand on the table, eyes locking with mine. "Maybe you're right. We like to think we were more perfect than you. But Leah, I'll admit something. My life isn't nearly as perfect as I pretend." Daniel turned to her in surprise, but Natalie went on, her voice breaking. "Daniel and I have been in marriage counseling for over a year. The charity galas, the luxury vacations, they're just ways to cover the emptiness. Most days I feel like I'm playing a role instead of actually living." I was stunned. Natalie, the sister who once smiled from the cover of magazines, was now confessing her unhappiness. Christopher slammed the file down on the table and sighed heavily. "And me? I've lived my whole life trying to please Mom and Dad. Yale, the career ladder, the perfect executive image. But Leah, have I ever been truly happy? I hate at least half of my job. There are mornings I wake up and just want to disappear, to walk away from it all. But I can't. I'm terrified that if I let go, I'll be a failure in their eyes." For the first time I saw Christopher stripped bare. No arrogance, only a weary man crushed by expectations. Mom's eyes welled with tears as she took my hand. "My daughter, I'm sorry. All these years I didn't believe in you. I thought the only path to happiness was college and a wealthy marriage. But you've proven me wrong." Dad nodded, his voice hoarse. "Leah, I was too harsh. I thought you'd stumble and come crawling back. But today I am proud. Very proud." I listened, the bitterness inside me dissolving into a quiet sadness. All those years of struggling to prove myself were finally acknowledged. But the cost had been years of misunderstanding and disdain. Natalie spoke softly. "Leah, I know I was wrong giving you that gift card. Honestly, I just wanted to keep the image of being the successful sister helping her poor sibling. I wanted to shine brighter. Now I feel ashamed." Christopher gave a shaky smile, lifting his glass with trembling hands. "Me too. Every time I asked if you could pay rent, it wasn't real concern. It was just to feel superior. I owe you an apology." I looked at them, feeling both distant and familiar. They were no longer the flawless idols of our parents, but flawed, tired, even fractured human beings. "I don't need apologies," I said slowly. "I just need you to see me for who I am. Nothing more, nothing less." Mom broke into sobs and Dad pushed himself up to embrace me tightly. He whispered, "Leah, my daughter. I finally see you." The air in the living room shifted. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider in my own family. The three of us sat together, no roles, no comparisons, only raw truth. And in that moment I realized, the shock I had delivered didn't just humble them, it forced them to face their own supposedly perfect lives. Christopher leaned back in his chair, the tension draining from his face. Natalie twisted her wedding ring, her eyes unsettled as if trying to make peace with herself. I looked around and saw both Mom and Dad sitting silently. Mom dabbed her red eyes with a tissue, while Dad gripped my hand as though letting go meant losing me. I spoke slowly. If we really want to change, it has to start today. No more comparisons, no more putting someone down just to make ourselves shine brighter. I've lived like a shadow for too many years, and I won't let that continue. Christopher nodded slightly. He sighed and for the first time let go of his pride. I agree. I'll try to live more honestly with myself, and be grateful for what you've done for Mom and Dad. Natalie looked at me, her voice trembling. Leah, I'm sorry for all the times I hurt you. I want to start over, not as rivals but as real sisters. I stayed quiet for a moment, then nodded. Not because apologies could erase the wounds, but because I realized everyone deserves a second chance. Marissa stepped in and gently reminded me, the helicopter is ready, Leah. We can fly to the care facility anytime. I turned to my parents, then to Christopher and Natalie. Do you want to come? To see for yourselves where Mom and Dad will be cared for, not with calculations over dollars, but with complete peace of mind. Christopher hesitated, then stood. I'll go. I need to see it with my own eyes. Natalie took Daniel's hand and they both nodded. When the whole family stepped onto the lawn, the rotor wash whipping our hair, I saw no trace of scorn in their eyes anymore. Instead, there was curiosity mixed with respect. We flew together to the medical center my foundation had built. As we landed, the sight of green trees and glowing windows brought tears to Mom's eyes. Leah, this is the place you prepared for us? I nodded, squeezing her hand. Yes, Mom. Everything here is ready so you and Dad can live comfortably and safely without worry. Dad walked slowly through the small garden, touched a wooden bench under the arbor, and his eyes lit up. He turned back to me, his voice deep but steady. Daughter, this is the first time I feel truly at peace about our future. Those words broke my heart open. After years of enduring contempt, one acknowledgement was enough to bring me to tears. As we sat in the reception room, I handed them a folder. The Everhart Foundation has signed a financial commitment to cover Mom and Dad's care for life. None of us needs to divide expenses anymore. Christopher held the file, speechless. He lifted his eyes to me, speaking slowly. Leah, I used to think success only mattered when you stood at the top of a career ladder. But today I see real value lies in how we use that success to love others. Natalie held Mom's hand and whispered, I want to be part of the foundation too. Not to show off, but to finally do something that matters. I smiled, seeing sincerity in her words for the first time. That evening when we returned to Cedarfield, the air felt lighter. No comparisons, no forced smiles. We sat together simply as a family. Mom reminisced about childhood stories. Dad chimed in with old tales that made us laugh. Christopher no longer bragged about his title. Natalie stopped talking about parties. They listened as I shared my journey, truly wanting to know who I was. Late at night, as I stepped onto the porch under the golden glow of the lights, Christopher joined me with 2 cups of coffee. Sitting beside me, he said quietly, Leah, you've changed everything. Not just for Mom and Dad, but for me and Natalie too. We can't erase the years behind us, but I want us to live honestly as real siblings from now on. I lifted my cup, clinked it lightly against his, and felt a relief I had never known. For the first time I understood. Wealth isn't in bank accounts or luxury homes. It's in this moment, when family removes the masks, when true feelings are finally acknowledged. I closed my eyes, letting the cold night wind brush past, and smiled inside. At last, Leah had found something far more precious than any fortune, genuine connection. In real life, many of us have been underestimated simply because we didn't follow the familiar path our families or society expected. Leah's story reminds us that success isn't always measured by wealth, titles, or appearances. True value lies in living authentically and using what we've achieved to love and share. When the masks are removed, what remains isn't status. It's genuine love and mutual respect within a family. What do you think about Leah's story and the changes in her family? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to follow the channel to keep exploring more heartfelt stories about family life.